Winter did not break. It thinned, stretched, and hardened into something sharper. And by the time the fifth stretch of deep cold settled over the valley, Caleb understood that what remained between him and the young bear was no longer a sequence of encounters, but a narrowing corridor that would end only one way. The yearling had not returned to the cabin door in several nights, yet its presence lingered in the form of widened tracks along outer ridges and subtle disturbances near the frozen creek. It was ranging farther now, carving larger loops through territory that once belonged, unquestioned, to him. Caleb responded by shifting from defense to pursuit. He stopped waiting within timber walls and instead began moving before dawn, tracing the younger bear's expanding routes in reverse, studying its feeding sites, its resting depressions, its travel angles. What he found confirmed what Winter had been shaping. The animal was growing rapidly, muscle thickening along shoulders, stride length extending with each passing week. The forepaw impressions no longer looked like those of a hesitant adolescent. They pressed deep and even, weight distributed with control. The hesitation that once defined its movements had thinned. On the fourth morning of his outward tracking, Caleb followed a fresh line of prints cutting north beyond the ridge into terrain he rarely entered. Rockier ground where sparse spruce gave way to exposed stone and wind-scoured flats. The tracks were unhurried, almost casual, and he moved quickly to close distance. By midday, he found where the bear had fed on a deer carcass. Ribs cracked cleanly, muscles stripped efficiently. This was no desperate scavenging. It was confident predation. Caleb crouched beside the remains and touched the edge of torn hide. Warmth still lingered faintly beneath the cold. The bear was near. He rose, rifle already braced, scanning the surrounding rock formations. Wind drifted lightly from the west, carrying his scent across open ground. Seconds later, he heard the low crunch of stone behind him. He pivoted sharply. The young bear stood atop a flat outcrop 20 yards away, elevated and exposed against pale sky. Its frame had broadened since their last close encounter at the cabin. Shoulders carried more mass. Head sat heavier on neck. It no longer appeared lean or uncertain. It looked formidable. Caleb steadied his aim instantly. The open rock offered no concealment for sudden lateral movement. Distance favored him. He aligned sight along the chest and began to apply pressure. The bear did not retreat. It stepped forward along the rock's edge, claws scraping faintly, its gaze fixed directly on him. No circling, no testing, direct confrontation. Caleb felt a pulse of cold clarity. This was the shift he had anticipated. The animal was no longer approaching to study. It was challenging ground. He tightened pressure further. Just as the trigger neared break, the bear dropped from the outcrop into a shallow depression beyond his line of sight. Caleb fired a split second late. The bullet struck stone, ricocheting sharply. The bear reappeared instantly from a different angle, charging not directly at him, but along a curved trajectory that closed distance diagonally. Caleb pivoted to track. Snow and gravel scattered under heavy paws. He fired again. The shot grazed along the bear's flank, drawing a burst of blood, but failing to halt momentum. The animal did not roar. It accelerated. Caleb backpedaled toward a cluster of boulders that offered partial cover. He fired a third time. This round struck high along the shoulder, but did not anchor. The bear veered sharply at the last second, slamming into a rock face beside him, rather than colliding head-on. The impact sent fragments of ice and stone flying. Caleb stumbled sideways, regaining footing just as the bear swung a forepaw that carved through air inches from his chest. Claws sliced across the sleeve of his jacket, tearing fabric and grazing skin beneath. Pain flared hot and immediate. Caleb rolled behind the nearest boulder and fired blindly toward movement. The shot thundered across rock. The bear retreated several strides, circling wider rather than pressing the advantage. Blood streaked its fur more visibly now, yet posture remained aggressive. Caleb braced against the stone, heart pounding with controlled intensity, and forced breath into steady rhythm. This was no longer measured standoff. The young bear had initiated open assault. He edged sideways along the boulder's curve, seeking a clearer angle. The bear mirrored his movement at distance, circling opposite direction, forcing him to pivot constantly to avoid being flanked. For several tense seconds, neither committed fully. Then the bear lunged again, closing the arc. Caleb leaned out from cover and fired at near point-blank range. The bullet struck low along the ribcage. The impact staggered the animal mid-stride. It crashed partially into snow before regaining footing with a guttural snarl. The sound carried more depth now, less fractured. Caleb felt the thin line of blood soaking into his torn sleeve, warm against cold air. He could not allow the animal to recover distance again. He stepped from behind the boulder and advanced rather than retreating. The bear hesitated a fraction, surprised by the forward motion. Caleb seized that sliver of paws and fired again, aiming center mass. The shot drove into the chest with heavier recoil. The bear faltered, legs buckling briefly. Yet even wounded, it forced itself upright, retreating several strides before turning once more. They stood facing each other across churned snow and scattered stone. Blood marked both ground and fur. The distance between them felt thinner than ever. Caleb understood that this escalation had crossed into irreversible territory. One more decisive exchange would determine which of them continued through the next winter. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying his scent full into the bear's nostrils. The animal's muscles tightened visibly, and in that frozen stretch of rock and snow, beneath a sky stripped of warmth, the hunt that had once begun with a single shot now unfolded in full force, no longer shadowed by patience, but sharpened into open violence that neither could abandon. The wind cut harder across the exposed rock, carrying the metallic scent of blood between them as Caleb held his ground instead of retreating back toward timber. Because retreat now would grant the bear distance, it had already proven capable of turning into advantage. His torn sleeve burned where claws had grazed skin, warmth leaking beneath layers and freezing almost instantly against the air. But pain clarified rather than clouded. The young bear stood several yards away, chest rising heavier than before, dark streaks of blood cutting through thick winter fur, yet its posture remained coiled rather than collapsing. This was no panicked animal. It was committed. Caleb shifted his stance slightly to compensate for uneven stone beneath his boots, keeping the rifle steady despite wind that tugged at the barrel. The bear angled its body again, reducing its exposed chest while maintaining forward orientation, a movement subtle yet practiced. It had learned not only from instinct but from repetition of these confrontations. Caleb felt a cold flicker of recognition that he himself had shaped this pattern. He exhaled slowly and tightened his grip, knowing the next exchange would not allow time for recalculation. The bear lunged first this time, closing distance in a low, explosive rush that scattered gravel and snow. Caleb fired mid-charge. The bullet struck high along the neck but deflected at an angle, tearing muscle without penetrating deep enough. The bear did not slow. Caleb pivoted sharply to his left, forcing the animal to overshoot its direct line. Massive weight skidded across rock, claws scraping sparks against stone. Caleb cycled the rifle and fired again at near point-blank range. The round struck center mass, deeper than previous hits. The impact forced a guttural roar from the bear that echoed across the open flats. It twisted violently, swiping backward with a forepaw that caught Caleb across the thigh. The force knocked him sideways into snow and stone. Breath exploded from his lungs. The rifle slipped from his grasp and skidded several feet away. For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to white glare and the thunder of blood in his ears. The bear pivoted instantly, advancing with lethal speed toward his exposed position. Caleb rolled hard to the side, barely avoiding a downward strike that cracked against the rock where his chest had been. Claws gouged deep trenches into stone. He scrambled toward the rifle, boots slipping on ice. The bear lunged again, jaws snapping within inches of his shoulder. He felt hot breath through torn fabric. Fingers closed around the rifle stock, just as weight slammed into him. They collided in a violent tangle of fur and cloth. Caleb jammed the barrel upward between them and fired blindly. The shot exploded at near contact distance, the recoil jarring his shoulder brutally. The bullet entered along the lower chest beneath the rib line. The bear recoiled with a roar that shook the air. Blood sprayed across snow and Caleb's jacket. The animal staggered back several strides, head shaking violently as if to clear disorientation. Caleb forced himself to his feet despite the burning pain along his thigh, raising the rifle once more. Distance between them had widened to perhaps 12 yards. The bear swayed, one foreleg trembling slightly under weight, yet its eyes remained fixed, unbroken. Caleb steadied his aim with both hands, now slick with blood not entirely his own. He aligned the sight carefully beneath the jaw where bone thinned. The bear attempted one final surge forward, but momentum faltered mid-step. Caleb fired. The bullet struck beneath the throat and drove upward. The bear's body jolted, forelegs buckling fully this time. It collapsed heavily onto the rock-strewn snow, sliding several feet before coming to rest against a low drift. Silence followed in ragged fragments, broken only by harsh, labored breathing that slowed with each exhale. Caleb remained aimed, chest heaving, waiting for another attempt to rise. None came. The young bear's sides lifted twice more, then settled. Wind swept across the flats, carrying loose snow over the spreading pool of dark red. Caleb did not lower the rifle immediately. He stepped forward cautiously, boots crunching against frost-hardened ground. Up close, the animal looked larger than it had even moments earlier, growth accelerated by winter survival. Its fur was thick, eyes half open but unfocused. Caleb stood over it, breath steadying gradually, pain along his thigh throbbing in time with pulse. The echo of previous winters pressed heavily against his thoughts. The adult on the ridge, the first cub fleeing into brush, the line of tracks leading to his door. This confrontation had not been reckless. It had been inevitable. He nudged the massive shoulder with the barrel. No response. The wind strengthened briefly, hissing across rock and snow. Caleb finally lowered the rifle, feeling weight settle into his bones. The hunt had reversed, and reversed again until it converged here on exposed stone beneath a sky stripped of color. Blood from both predator and man marked the ground. He bound his torn thigh with steady hands, tightening fabric until bleeding slowed. As he stood again and looked out across the open flats, he felt no surge of triumph, only a hard clarity that winter had demanded conclusion. Behind him, the forest line remained distant and still. No other shapes emerged. No third presence lingered. This had been the last continuation of that first shot years ago. As wind carried snow over the fallen body and began to soften its outline, Caleb understood that the balance had been resolved not through patience, but through escalation neither had abandoned. And under the cold, relentless sky of Alaska, the clearing between them narrowed to silence at last. The wind did not ease after the fall. It pressed harder across the flats, as though determined to erase the violence that had just unfolded, driving loose snow into the churned ground, where blood darkened rock. And Caleb remained standing over the young bear, longer than he intended, rifle lowered but still gripped tightly, as if expecting another surge despite the stillness. The animal lay heavy against the drift, fur already stiffening where crimson seeped outward and froze into brittle edges. Its size struck him fully now, broader than the yearling that once clawed at his shed in a blizzard. Shoulders thick with muscle hardened by winter, eyes half-lidded, yet reflecting the pale sky in a way that felt almost watchful. Caleb forced himself to move. His thigh burned with every step, fabric torn and stiffening with blood, but he could not remain exposed on open stone. He scanned the horizon carefully for any sign of additional movement. Nothing stirred beyond wind and distant tree line. Slowly, methodically, he checked the bear's body for final confirmation, prodding with the rifle barrel before crouching closer. Breath no longer fogged from its muzzle. No tremor traveled through its flank. The contest that had stretched across seasons had ended here. Yet as he knelt there, a strange weight settled in his chest. Not relief, nor regret, but something closer to gravity. The recognition that this outcome had been forged long before today's exchange. He rose and dragged the body a short distance away from the boulder cluster, to a patch of deeper snow, both to prevent scavengers from reaching it too quickly and to clear the immediate ground. The effort sent pain flashing along his injured leg, forcing him to pause repeatedly. Once the bear lay positioned against the drift, he stepped back and surveyed the scene. Churned snow, scattered stone, his own blood mingled with the animal's. He tightened the makeshift bandage at his thigh, teeth clenched as pressure steadied the flow. Dusk crept across the flats in thin blue shadows. He needed to return to the cabin before full dark claimed the terrain. Leaving the body behind for now, he limped toward the ridge path, moving slower than before, senses still alert despite exhaustion. Every sound of wind brushing rock triggered reflexive glances over his shoulder. Yet nothing followed. The forest remained distant and still. Halfway to the creek, he paused and looked back. The bear's dark mass was already half veiled by drifting snow, edges softening as if the land itself was reclaiming shape. A memory surfaced unbidden. The first cub vanishing into brush years ago, smaller prints dissolving beneath wind. He pushed the thought aside and continued. By the time he reached the cabin, night had thickened fully. He secured the door behind him and sank briefly against the wall, breath unsteady now that tension had drained. Inside, the pelt of the adult remained coiled along the far wall, heavy and inert. He lit the stove higher and cleaned his wound properly, flushing torn flesh with melted snow and alcohol until the sting steadied his focus. He stitched the deeper cut along his thigh with careful precision, hands practiced from years of isolation. Pain anchored him to the present. Once bandaged securely, he leaned back in the chair beside the stove and let heat seep into cold bones. Outside, wind continued its low, relentless sweep. No scratching at the shed, no pacing at treeline, only open silence. Yet silence did not feel empty. It felt altered. Hours passed as he sat there, rifle resting within reach, listening. The absence of presence was almost louder than any roar. He replayed the fight in precise fragments, the diagonal charge, the swipe that tore his sleeve, the final shot beneath the jaw. He acknowledged each detail clinically, cataloging errors and adjustments, even though no further confrontation remained. Sometime after midnight, he rose and stepped outside despite the cold, needing to see the clearing under starlight. The snow reflected faint silver beneath a cloudless sky. No fresh tracks marked its surface. Wind had smoothed every line. He stood there long enough for frost to gather along his eyelashes. For the first time in many winters, he felt no immediate sense of being observed. The air carried only the clean, indifferent scent of ice and distant timber. He turned slowly in a full circle, scanning ridge and creek and tree line. Nothing moved. When he returned inside and barred the door again, he felt the weight of finality settle. Not in triumph, not in victory, but in completion. The hunt had reversed, escalated, and ended. Yet as he lay down that night with pain dulling under fatigue, a single thought lingered at the edge of consciousness. Winter was long, and Alaska remembered more than men ever intended. Outside, beyond the ridge where the young bear lay still beneath deepening snow, the land continued its quiet rhythm, wind tracing over blood-stained rock, until even that dark mark began to fade into white. Morning broke slow and pale, light spilling across the valley like diluted steel, and Caleb stepped out of the cabin with measured stiffness, the stitched wound along his thigh tight but holding. The wind had calmed overnight, leaving the world unnaturally still, and for the first time in years, the clearing held no fresh sign beyond his own path from the night before. He stood there a long moment, rifle resting in his hands out of habit rather than necessity, and listened. Nothing answered. No pacing at the tree line, no distant crack of movement on the ridge, only the faint whisper of frost settling into timber. He began the slow walk back toward the exposed flats where the young bear had fallen. Not hurried, not hesitant. Each step carried a finality he did not voice. When he crested the ridge, the scene below appeared softened by drift. Snow already smoothing the violent geometry of churned rock and blood. The body lay half-covered, dark fur dulled beneath frost, edges blurred as though the land itself had begun erasing it. Caleb approached cautiously despite certainty. The bear remained still, heavy and inert against the drift. He stood over it again in the cold daylight, taking in the size one last time. Winter had shaped it quickly, brutally. He crouched and brushed snow from the fur near the wound beneath the jaw where the final shot had entered. The line was clean, decisive. There would be no rising from this. He exhaled slowly and straightened. Scavenger tracks had not yet reached the site, though they would soon. He considered skinning the body as he had the adult. Yet something held him back. The hide of the first had been necessity and proof. This felt different. He stepped away without reaching for his knife. The wind carried faint currents across the flats, beginning the slow burial. Caleb turned and surveyed the valley, ridge to creek, cabin to tree line, territory that had been contested for seasons. The tension that once vibrated beneath every movement was absent now, replaced by a stillness so complete it almost felt foreign. He descended carefully and returned to the cabin before midday. Inside, the adult's pelt hung where he had left it, dark and thick against timber. He regarded it for several minutes before lifting it from its hook and folding it slowly. The weight pressed heavily against his arms. He stepped outside once more and walked to the edge of the clearing. There he paused, scanning the forest as if expecting interruption. None came. With deliberate motion, he carried the pelt beyond the immediate perimeter and laid it across the base of a spruce near the tree line, leaving it exposed rather than stored. He did not speak. He did not explain the act even to himself. He simply stepped back and allowed wind to tug faintly at the fur. Then he returned to the cabin and barred the door behind him. The rest of the day passed in practical silence. He cleaned weapons thoroughly, restocked supplies, reinforced the bandage on his thigh, and repaired the torn sleeve of his jacket. Each task felt stripped of urgency. As evening approached, he stepped outside once more. The pelt remained where he had placed it, snow gathering lightly along its edges. No tracks approached yet. Dusk spread slowly across the valley, turning white into muted blue. Caleb stood in the open doorway, rifle resting loosely in his hand, and listened to a silence that now felt complete rather than tense. Somewhere in the distance, a lone raven called, sharp and brief, then faded. He closed the door gently and leaned against it, eyes briefly closed. The hunt had ended not in sudden peace, but in exhaustion. Balance had been forced through escalation. Neither side abandoned. Winter would continue, storms would rise again, and tracks would still form across the clearing in seasons to come. But the line that began with a single shot years earlier had reached its final mark. Outside, wind lifted lightly, carrying snow across the fallen young bear and over the folded pelt at the tree line, softening edges, erasing contrast. By morning, both would be further swallowed by white, and in the quiet heart of Alaska, beneath a sky indifferent and vast, the land held no memory of who had hunted and who had fallen. Only the endless rhythm of cold and silence stretching forward into another winter.